In the year 1137 AD, on the banks of the Tigris River in the city of Tikrit, a child was born on a night that seemed ordinary to the world but extraordinary to history. His name was Yusuf ibn Ayyub. No crown awaited him at birth, no prophecy was announced in the skies, and no throne stood prepared for him. Yet this child would one day become the symbol of justice, mercy, courage, and faith for millions across generations. The world would remember him as Sultan Salahuddin Ayubi, known in the West as Saladin. Yusuf was born into a Kurdish family known more for discipline and honor than for wealth or luxury. His father, Najm al-Din Ayyub, was a respected military officer, a man of calm temperament and deep faith. His household was not one of extravagance but of principles. From his earliest days, Yusuf grew up surrounded by conversations of duty, loyalty, and responsibility. He learned early that power without morality was nothing but cruelty, and strength without mercy was only another form of weakness. The Muslim world into which Yusuf was born was fractured. Once united lands were now divided into rival kingdoms, each ruler guarding his own throne while ignoring the greater wounds of the Ummah. Jerusalem, the sacred heart of Islam, had fallen to the Crusaders decades earlier. The stories of that loss were still fresh, whispered with pain and tears. Men spoke of mosques turned into slaughterhouses and of streets filled with innocent blood. These were not distant tales for Yusuf. They were wounds carried in the collective memory of his people. Unlike many boys of his age, Yusuf was not drawn to noise or reckless games. He preferred silence, study, and reflection. He memorized the Quran, studied Islamic law, history, and Arabic literature. His teachers noticed something unusual in him. He listened more than he spoke, and when he spoke, his words carried weight beyond his years. He was not fueled by anger, but by purpose. Even as a child, he questioned injustice and expressed sorrow over Muslim disunity. As Yusuf grew into adolescence, fate began to shape his path more clearly. His uncle, Asad al-Din Shirkuh, was a powerful and seasoned military commander under Nur ad-Din Zengi, the ruler of Syria. Shirkuh recognized in Yusuf a rare balance of intellect and restraint. Though Yusuf himself had no burning desire for war, he understood that knowledge alone could not defend truth without strength. He joined his uncle on military campaigns, not as a reckless warrior, but as a disciplined observer, learning strategy, leadership, and the harsh realities of power. Egypt at that time stood at the center of political struggle. The Fatimid Caliphate ruled there, weakened by internal corruption and ideological division, while the Crusaders watched eagerly, waiting for the moment to seize it. Syria could not afford to let Egypt fall. Thus began the campaigns that would change Yusuf's life forever. In Egypt, Yusuf saw suffering on a scale he had never imagined. Heavy taxes crushed the poor. Corrupt officials enriched themselves while the common people starved. Power was maintained through fear rather than justice. These scenes left deep marks on his heart. He realized that the enemy of Islam was not only outside its borders, but also within its systems. When Shirkuh died in 1169 AD, the court faced a difficult decision. Against expectations, Yusuf ibn Ayyub was appointed vizier of Egypt. Many doubted him. He was young, soft-spoken, and known more for piety than ruthlessness. Enemies assumed he would be easy to manipulate. They were wrong. Yusuf did not rush to assert dominance. He began with reform. He abolished unjust taxes, restored Sunni practices, rebuilt mosques, and reopened centers of learning. He won the loyalty of the people not through fear but through fairness. Slowly, the Fatimid Caliphate faded, and Egypt returned to Sunni Islam without mass bloodshed. This peaceful transformation shocked both friends and enemies. As his authority grew, Yusuf understood that Egypt alone was not enough. The Muslim world could not defeat the Crusaders unless it was united. His loyalty to Nur ad-Din Zengi remained firm, but destiny had larger plans. When Nur ad-Din passed away, the fragile unity of Muslim lands once again stood at risk. Yusuf stepped forward, not as a usurper, but as a protector of stability. Over time, Egypt and Syria came under his control. With careful diplomacy and calculated military action, he unified vast territories, including Hijaz and Yemen. This unity was not built overnight, nor was it maintained by terror. It was built on trust, justice, and the belief that the liberation of Jerusalem required collective sacrifice. Yet despite all his power, Yusuf remained unchanged in character. He lived simply, ate modestly, prayed regularly, and feared accountability before God more than rebellion from men. He refused luxury, reminding his court that leadership was a burden, not a privilege. In his private moments, he returned to the same thought that had haunted him since childhood: Jerusalem. The city was not merely a strategic objective, it was a spiritual obligation. Every decision he made, every alliance he formed, and every battle he planned revolved around that sacred goal. The stage was now set. The armies were forming. The Crusaders, confident in their fortresses, underestimated the man who had united the Muslim world not through terror, but through belief. They did not yet understand that they were about to face not just a general, but a leader shaped by faith, restraint, and an unbreakable sense of justice. This was only the beginning. As Salahuddin's influence expanded across Egypt and Syria, the balance of power in the region began to shift in ways the Crusaders had not anticipated. For decades, they had relied on Muslim disunity more than their own strength. Now, for the first time since their arrival in the Holy Land, they faced a leader who did not rush blindly into battle, who did not waste lives for pride, and who did not allow emotion to cloud strategy. Salahuddin observed, waited, and prepared with patience that unnerved his enemies. His army was not merely trained in combat, but disciplined in purpose. Soldiers were reminded constantly that they were not fighting for land or wealth, but for responsibility and faith. Looting was forbidden. Civilians were to be protected. Even prisoners were to be treated with dignity. Many commanders questioned this approach, believing mercy to be a weakness. Salahuddin proved otherwise. Loyalty grew deeper, morale stronger, and his forces became united not by fear of punishment, but by respect for their leader. The Crusader states of Jerusalem, Tripoli, Antioch, and Edessa stood fortified, confident behind stone walls and European reinforcements. Their leaders mocked the idea that a single Muslim ruler could threaten their dominance. They mistook Salahuddin's restraint for hesitation. In reality, he was waiting for the right moment, understanding that one decisive blow was better than 100 reckless attacks. That moment came gradually, shaped by Crusader arrogance. Reynold of Chatillon, one of the most brutal Crusader lords, repeatedly violated peace treaties, attacking Muslim caravans and even threatening the sacred cities of Mecca and Medina. These actions were not merely political provocations, they were spiritual insults. Salahuddin attempted diplomacy, sent warnings, and sought to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. Each warning was ignored. When Reynold attacked a caravan that included Muslim women and children, Salahuddin's patience reached its limit. He swore an oath that would echo through history. He declared that the violation of sacred trust would not go unanswered. Yet even then, his response was calculated, not impulsive. He began mobilizing forces from across the unified Muslim lands, calling upon allies not with threats, but with a reminder of shared duty. The year 1187 approached, and tension filled the air. Armies gathered, banners rose, and the land itself seemed to hold its breath. The Crusaders, confident in their heavy armor and numbers, marched toward what they believed would be another demonstration of their superiority. They underestimated the terrain, the heat, and most of all, the mind of the man opposing them. Near the horns of Hattin, Salahuddin executed one of the most brilliant military strategies of medieval history. He cut off the Crusaders from water sources, forcing them to march under the burning sun, exhausted and desperate. Smoke filled the air as dry grass was set ablaze, adding chaos to their ranks. What followed was not merely a battle, but a collapse. The Crusader army was crushed. Knights who had once terrorized villages now begged for water. Kings were captured. Pride turned into panic. For the Muslim world, Hattin was more than a victory. It was a revival of hope long buried under defeat. Reynold of Chatillon was brought before Salahuddin, offered water as a gesture of mercy. He drank, assuming protection under Islamic custom. Salahuddin clarified that the offer of mercy had not come from him. Reynold was held accountable for his crimes, and Salahuddin personally carried out the sentence. Even in this moment, it was not revenge that guided him, but justice. After Hattin, city after city fell with minimal resistance. The Crusader defenses collapsed like dominoes, and then, at last, Jerusalem stood before him. The city that had bled for nearly 90 years awaited its fate. When the Crusaders had taken Jerusalem in 1099, they slaughtered indiscriminately. Blood flowed through the streets. History remembered that brutality with horror. Now the world watched, expecting the same in return. But Salahuddin was not that man. After negotiations, Jerusalem surrendered. Salahuddin entered the city not as a conqueror drunk on victory, but as a servant aware of accountability before God. No massacre followed. Churches were protected. Civilians were spared. Ransoms were set low, and those who could not pay were freed anyway. Jewish families, long persecuted under Crusader rule, were allowed to return. Mercy replaced vengeance. The contrast stunned Europe. Even Christian chroniclers recorded his conduct with admiration. In an age of cruelty, Salahuddin chose humanity. Despite this triumph, peace did not come easily. The Third Crusade followed, bringing figures like Richard the Lionheart into conflict with him. Their battles were fierce, but marked by mutual respect. When Richard fell ill, Salahuddin sent him fruit and medicine. When Richard's horse was killed, Salahuddin sent him another. These acts were not weakness. They were statements of character. Years of war drained the treasury and exhausted the land. Salahuddin gave everything he had to the cause. By the time of his death, in 1193 in Damascus, the ruler of vast territories owned almost nothing personally. His wealth had been spent on soldiers, scholars, widows, and the poor. When he died, there was not enough money to pay for his burial. This was the final testimony of the man he had been. Salahuddin Ayubi did not live to be remembered by monuments or riches. He lived to be remembered as a standard of leadership rooted in faith, strength balanced by mercy, and power restrained by justice. His legacy was not only the liberation of Jerusalem, but the proof that true victory lies not in destruction, but in dignity. After the liberation of Jerusalem, many believed that Salahuddin's mission had reached its peak, that the story of struggle had found its triumphant ending. But for Salahuddin himself, victory did not bring rest. It brought responsibility. The weight of what he had achieved pressed heavily upon his soul, because he understood something few rulers ever grasped. Holding power with justice was far more difficult than seizing it through war. The lands under his rule were vast and diverse. Arabs, Kurds, Turks, Persians, Christians, Jews, and Muslims of different schools of thought lived under one authority. Salahuddin knew that unity forged by the sword alone would crumble quickly. What was needed now was healing. He traveled constantly, listening to complaints, correcting governors, and removing officials who abused their positions. He refused to isolate himself in palaces. Wherever he went, the people saw him not as a distant emperor, but as a servant entrusted with their welfare. Despite his efforts for peace, war refused to leave him. The Third Crusade brought renewed danger. Europe poured its anger, pride, and fear into a final attempt to reclaim Jerusalem. Richard the Lionheart emerged as Salahuddin's greatest opponent, a man fearless in battle and relentless in ambition. Their encounters were fierce, their armies clashed repeatedly, yet something unusual defined their conflict. It was not blind hatred, but recognition of strength in one another. On the battlefield, Salahuddin was relentless. He moved swiftly, striking where the enemy was weakest, retreating when necessary, never allowing pride to override reason. He avoided unnecessary bloodshed, often choosing negotiation over slaughter. When Acre fell after a long siege and Richard ordered the execution of thousands of Muslim prisoners, Salahuddin was devastated, not because of military loss, but because of human cruelty. He responded not with similar brutality, but by strengthening defenses and protecting civilians. In moments of hardship, Salahuddin's inner world revealed itself more clearly. He spent long nights in prayer, seeking guidance, not victory. He feared failing God more than losing territory. His advisors sometimes urged him toward harsher decisions, but he resisted. He believed that leadership without moral boundaries was no leadership at all. His health began to weaken as years of struggle took their toll. Sleepless nights, endless campaigns, and constant pressure wore down his body. Still, he refused comfort. When offered luxury, he declined. When praised excessively, he reminded others that all success came from God alone. His tent was simple, his meals modest, his clothing plain. Eventually, both sides realized that endless war would consume everything. A treaty was signed with Richard, allowing Christian pilgrims access to Jerusalem while the city remained under Muslim control. It was not a total victory, but it was a just peace. Salahuddin understood that lasting stability required compromise, not annihilation. In his final years, he turned increasingly toward scholars, students, and the poor. He funded schools, hospitals, and orphanages. He freed slaves, he forgave debts, he prepared himself not for history's judgment, but for God's. When death finally came in 1193, it came quietly. No grand procession, no golden coffin. The man who had ruled lands stretching from Egypt to Syria left behind almost nothing. His treasurer recorded that he owned only a few coins, not even enough for a proper burial. Friends and followers were forced to collect donations to shroud his body. At his funeral, a flag was raised with a simple message meant to silence pride forever. The conqueror of Jerusalem left this world with nothing. No wealth, no possessions, no throne, only deeds, yet his legacy was immense. Muslim children grew up hearing his name spoken with reverence. Even in Europe, poets and historians wrote of him with admiration. He became the rare figure respected by both sides of a brutal divide. Not because he was flawless, but because he was principled. Salahuddin Ayubi did not seek immortality, but history granted it to him anyway. Not as a symbol of conquest, but as proof that power guided by faith and mercy can change the course of the world. And still, the lessons of his life remain unfinished, waiting for those willing to learn from them. Time passed, but the memory of Salahuddin Ayubi did not fade with his death. In the years immediately following him, the empire he had built began to fragment, as often happens when a ruler's character is stronger than the institutions he leaves behind. Yet even as borders shifted and dynasties weakened, his name remained untouched by decay. It lived not in stone walls or official decrees, but in stories told by soldiers, scholars, travelers, and even former enemies. Those who had served under him spoke of a leader who never raised his voice in arrogance, who never humiliated a subordinate, and who never treated victory as a personal achievement. When mistakes were made, he corrected them quietly. When success came, he attributed it to God. This humility created a rare bond between ruler and ruled. Men followed him not because they feared punishment, but because they believed in his purpose. Salahuddin's vision of leadership extended far beyond the battlefield. He understood that ignorance was as dangerous as invasion. Throughout his lands, he established centers of learning, encouraging the study of theology, law, medicine, and philosophy. Scholars found protection under his rule. Debate was welcomed, not silenced. He believed that a strong society was one where minds were sharpened alongside swords. His treatment of religious minorities continued to define his legacy. Christians and Jews lived under Muslim rule with security and legal protection. Their places of worship were respected. This was not tolerance born of political convenience, but a principle rooted in his understanding of Islamic justice. In an age where difference often meant death, Salahuddin chose coexistence. In Europe, news of his conduct traveled faster than armies. Chroniclers who once described Muslims as barbarians struggled to reconcile their prejudice with reality. Some attempted to dismiss him as an exception. Others, more honest, acknowledged his nobility. Over time, his image evolved into something almost legendary, a Muslim ruler who embodied the very chivalry Europe claimed as its own. Yet Salahuddin himself would have rejected all praise. He did not fight to be admired. He fought because he believed responsibility demanded action. His inner struggle, the constant effort to restrain ego, anger, and ambition, was greater than any external war. Those closest to him noted that his greatest fear was not defeat, but injustice committed in his name. Stories from his final days reveal this truth clearly. When reminded of his victories, he wept. When asked why, he replied that he feared God might question him about every life lost, every hardship endured by his people. This fear was not weakness, it was conscience. Generations later, his name continued to surface whenever leadership was discussed. Parents spoke of him to teach children about honor. Scholars cited him when writing about just governance. Soldiers remembered him as proof that strength and mercy could coexist. Even political rivals invoked his memory, hoping some of his legitimacy would reflect upon them. Yet perhaps the most powerful legacy he left behind was not political or military, but moral. He proved that it was possible to resist oppression without becoming oppressive. That victory did not require cruelty. That faith, when sincere, could guide power rather than excuse its abuse. In a world that often rewards brutality and ambition, Salahuddin Ayubi stood as a contradiction. He reminded history that true greatness lies not in domination, but in restraint. Not in revenge, but in justice. Not in glory, but in service. The centuries that followed would witness countless wars, countless rulers, and countless claims of righteousness. Few would be remembered. Fewer still would be respected by both friend and foe. Salahuddin Ayubi remained one of those rare names spoken without bitterness, without mockery, without shame. His story, though rooted in the 12th century, continues to speak to every age that struggles with power, faith, and morality. It asks a simple but uncomfortable question: what kind of leader does the world truly need? The answer, though difficult, was already written in the life of a man who once owned almost nothing, yet left behind a legacy that time itself could not erase. Long after the dust of battles settled and the echoes of marching armies faded, the figure of Salahuddin Ayubi continued to stand tall in the quiet corridors of history. Empires rose and fell, rulers claimed greatness and vanished, but his name endured with an unusual clarity, untouched by the corrosion of time. This endurance was not accidental. It was earned through a life lived in constant awareness that power is temporary, while accountability is eternal. What separated Salahuddin from so many before and after him was not merely what he achieved, but what he refused to become. He refused to allow hatred to shape his decisions. He refused to let victory intoxicate him. He refused to treat human lives as expendable tools of ambition. In a world where rulers often measured success by the fear they inspired, he measured it by the justice he delivered. The people who lived under his rule remembered him not as a distant legend, but as a presence that had touched their lives directly. Farmers spoke of fair taxation that allowed them to survive harsh seasons. Merchants spoke of safe roads and honest courts. Scholars spoke of freedom to teach and write without fear. The poor remembered open doors, and widows remembered dignity restored. These memories formed a legacy stronger than stone fortresses. Even his enemies could not erase him. Crusader soldiers who survived their encounters carried home stories that contradicted everything they had been taught. They spoke of a Muslim leader who honored agreements, who protected the weak, who showed restraint when cruelty would have been easier. Over time, these accounts softened hardened hearts and reshaped perceptions. Salahuddin became one of the few figures respected across a divide built on blood and belief. Yet behind this towering legacy stood a man deeply aware of his own limitations. He never believed himself flawless. He sought forgiveness often, worried endlessly, and prayed constantly. His strength came not from certainty in himself, but from submission to something greater than himself. This humility anchored him when temptation whispered and power beckoned. As centuries passed, his life became a mirror held up to every generation. Leaders saw in him a standard they struggled to reach. The oppressed saw proof that resistance could be noble. The faithful saw an example of belief translated into action. His story did not demand admiration, it demanded reflection. In times of chaos, his name resurfaced as a reminder that unity is possible without tyranny, and that justice is achievable without bloodlust. He showed that faith could guide policy, not corrupt it, that mercy could strengthen authority, not weaken it. These lessons, though ancient, remain painfully relevant. Salahuddin Ayubi did not leave behind instructions carved in marble. He left behind a life that spoke louder than any decree. A life that argued without words, that true leadership begins with self-discipline, grows through service, and is judged not by victories won, but by values preserved. When history asked what kind of man could reclaim Jerusalem without drowning it in blood, the answer was written in his conduct. When time questioned whether power and morality could coexist, his life stood as evidence. And when future generations wondered whether greatness required cruelty, his legacy whispered a firm and enduring no. In the end, Salahuddin Ayubi belonged neither to the East nor the West, neither to one era nor one people alone. He belonged to history itself, as a reminder of what humanity can achieve when conscience leads and ego follows. His story does not conclude with his death, because stories rooted in principle never truly end. They wait quietly for the next generation to decide whether they will be remembered merely as history or lived as example. And so the name Salahuddin Ayubi remains not as a shadow of the past, but as a light held up to the future. How did you like this story? This is not fiction or imagination, but real Islamic history based on true events. The life of Sultan Salahuddin Ayubi belongs to the 12th century, mainly between 1137 AD and 1193 AD, a time when the Muslim world faced division, crusades, and the struggle for Jerusalem. Every event mentioned here reflects a real era, real battles, and real sacrifices that shaped Islamic history. If you want to watch more such real and authentic Islamic history videos, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like this video, share it with others, and comment your thoughts. The Real History